so hopefully everyone can see the screen. I've got my slides starting up here. My name is John Zablocki. I'm a developer advocate for Couchbase. I'm also an author at O'Reilly. I'm currently working on a book on Orchard CMS.
Hey, John. Catherine here. I don't mean to interrupt, but we can't see your screen yet. Did you actually start the screen sharing?
Let me just double check that.
Okay, now it's coming through. All right, thanks.
All right, sorry about that, guys. Screen sharing is a two-phase commit. All right, so again, my name is John Zablocki. I'm a developer advocate at Couchbase. I'm an author at O'Reilly Media, currently working on a book on Orchard CMS. That should be out this spring. And on Twitter, you can find me at CodeVoyeur. And today, for about the next hour or so, I'm going to talk to you about developing with Couchbase and .NET. Before we get going, I just want to walk through the agenda quickly. My assumption is that most of you are probably somewhat familiar with Couchbase Server, or at least have a general idea of what it is. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about server features today. We're going to focus mostly on the client, but I will go over the basics of the server just to make sure that at least everyone has a general idea of what the server offers. And then we'll dig into the Couchbase.NET Client Library, where to get it, what it is, and we're going to poke around at the API using Ironpython. And if you don't know what Ironpython is, you will after that section. And then we'll have a couple of demos, and how deep we go depends on time. The first one will just be a simple hello world so you can understand how to use Couchbase from Visual Studio in a console app. And then we'll do a little more involved of a demo using Couchbase and MVC. And depending on time, we'll also touch on some of the new features in 2.0 and talk a little bit about what you need to do to start preparing for those changes today. So first, the elevator pitch for Couchbase Server. Couchbase Server is an open source NoSQL database. It's a distributed key value pair store. So you can sort of think of it as a big hash table that has persistence. Obviously, it's a lot more obviously it's a lot more complicated than that, but that's just a simple way to visualize it. It's compatible with Memcached. Memcached is a very popular open source caching library, distributed caching library, and that's been around for years. And Couchbase Server does offer API compatibility with that. There's zero downtime maintenance. So in other words, you can bring new nodes online, you can upgrade the server version, all without actually having to take down your database. That's both unique and very valuable to have. So as you add new nodes online into your cluster, you can also take advantage of auto sharding, so the data will redistribute without your having to do any extra work for that. We do offer some useful web-based management and monitoring tools. They are really good in 1.8. They're going to get better in 2.0. We have data replication, so you can set replication factors when you add a node to the cluster. We have auto failover. And importantly, we have support for multiple languages with official SDKs. Obviously, we're going to be talking about the .NET SDK today, but we do have PHP, we have Ruby, Java, and other languages will be coming. And the current production version of the server is 1.8. And that actually was released on Monday, so this presentation is kind of timed with that. And we also have the release of the new client library for .NET, which also came out Monday, and that's compatible with 1.8, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So the .NET Client Library is a fully managed provider for Couchbase Server, so everything is written in 100% C#, and it makes extensive use of the enum.memcached library. So if you've done anything with Memcached in .NET before, you've probably used the enum client. So we've, obviously that is a well-established, very powerful and flexible API, so we make use of that. And as I mentioned before, the current version of the server is 1.8. The current version of the client is 1.0. And the 1.0 client is compatible with 1.8. Excuse me. At the end of this talk, I'm going to talk to you about the new features of 2.0. Look out in the next few weeks. We'll be dropping a new developer preview of the client that will let you work with the 2.0 developer preview for the server. But right now, the current version of 1.0 does not give you access to the new features of the developer preview 2.0. So you won't be able to do everything with the client that you could do with the server. in 2.0, which is not released officially yet. And also, the Couchbase client library is open source as well as all of the other projects in our SDK set, and those are licensed under Apache 2.0. So how you install the client library, there are 3 ways. The first way, and we'll look at this when we jump into our first Visual Studio project, is to use NuGet. If you're not using NuGet, I definitely recommend checking it out. It's a package manager for managing dependencies within your Visual Studio projects. You can pretty much find anything from the Entity Framework to the Couchbase client to numerous large projects and small projects in between. So that's the preferred way of getting the latest version of the client. You can always download the latest from couchbase.com. And you can also, if you want to work with the source itself, you can get that at github.com/couchbase/couchbase.net client. So everything depends on what your use case is. You can definitely feel free to work with the source because it does give you a little bit more visibility into what's going on, but I imagine most people will prefer NuGet. Are there any questions before I move on to the actual API?
Hey, John, no.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Hey, John, no questions yet.
Okay.
Thanks.
All right. So, normally if you sat in on any .NET library presentation where you're exploring an API, the first thing that presenters tend to do is open up Visual Studio and poke around with IntelliSense. I actually prefer a different approach, which is to use Ironpython, which lets us kind of work in a very interactive way in a command line to understand the different methods that our API has to offer. So if you don't know what Ironpython is, let me just take a second to go over that. I'm assuming most people have heard of the Python language. Ironpython is the Python language just implemented for the .NET framework. It's built on top of the DLR, or the Dynamic Language Runtime. And if you haven't heard of the DLR is basically a set of extensibility points that are on top of the Common Language Runtime. So it's a layer on top of the CLR that lets dynamic languages like Python or Iron Ruby talk to the Common Language Runtime, or compiled languages like C#. And it's also used by C# for certain features like its dynamic keyword. So it's definitely worth checking out Ironpython just as an aside. But we're going to look in particular at its interactive interpreter feature, which will let us poke around at the API without having to create a Visual Studio project or anything like that. We can just very simply open up a command line and start poking around and learning a little bit more about the client. So I'm going to switch over to PowerShell. And even though I'm using PowerShell, I don't want anyone to think that this wouldn't work in the standard command line. Ironpython obviously will run from any command line that you choose. I just happen to like PowerShell. So I've also, just to note, I've installed Ironpython. You can get it from ironpython.net. And when you download it, it doesn't automatically put the IPY, which is the executable for the interpreter, into your path. So I have set up the environment variable so that I can just type IPY and bring up the interactive interpreter. So now that I'm in the interpreter, just to give you a quick taste for what it offers if you haven't seen it before, it's just a standard REPL that a lot of languages have, everything from Lisp to Boo to whatever other language you might have used. There's actually a C# interpreter, interactive interpreter, or REPL, that the Mono team has developed. So you can execute basic statements. You can do more interesting things. Let's say you wanted to explore the system.io namespace. You can import statements in Python are very similar to using statements in C#. They're a little different, but I won't get into the exact differences right now. But what I want to show is that kind of the usefulness of exploring an API from the command line, or at least what I perceive to be the usefulness. So I can create a new instance of a stream writer. Make sure I don't have another file named test. I can write bits to the file. And dispose it. And then I can open up a stream reader. And then I could read all the bytes, all the bits into a string. And you can see what Ironpython did was because the method had a return value, it automatically just prints it out to the screen. So if I had assigned it to a variable, because I've already read the stream, I'd have to read it. I'd have to go back to the beginning of the stream in order to read it again, which is why I had the blank line there. But you can basically see that if I want to start exploring an API, or if I want to start just writing some throwaway code, Ironpython is actually a pretty useful way to do that. You don't have the overhead of opening up Visual Studio, creating a console application. If you wanted to save your text, you can just create a .py file and run it with ipy.exe. So hopefully that gives you a sense of what Ironpython is and why someone might use it when they're first trying to understand how to work with a library. So with that, I'm going to switch over to actually using Ironpython with Couchbase. So the first thing I'm going to do is download the assemblies. So on Couchbase.com, if you click on the Develop section of our site, and then click on .NET, there'll be a few links for where you can go to get the source code, the NuGet package, or also the client library directly. So we have a zip of the Couchbase client and its dependency on Enum. So I'm just going to download the zip file. And now I'm just going to copy these into a directory that will be easy to remember. So the Couchbase DLL, that's the assembly that has the Couchbase client, the Couchbase configuration classes, so all the stuff that supports Couchbase directly. I mentioned before Enum.caching. This is the library that has all the Memcached support. So again, because Couchbase is Memcached compatible, Enum offers all of that support, and we obviously chose to go with something trusted and well tested for that sort of plumbing for Memcached. So I'm going to go back to PowerShell. So now what I need to do is add references to those two assemblies that we just downloaded. And this is very similar to adding a reference in Visual Studio, except that we're doing it from the command line. So to do it in Ironpython, I'm first going to import the CLR module. So the CLR module is what gives Ironpython the ability to add references to assemblies that might be in the GAC or on the file system somewhere. So once I have the CLR module imported, I can add a reference to the files that I just downloaded. So this R in front of the quotes that I've been using in the strings, if you're curious, that is what makes a string a verbatim string. That's similar to the @ sign in front of a string in C#. Just escapes, or it causes the strings to be interpreted verbatim without having to escape the backslashes and stuff. So I just put those in dev assemblies. And I have a typo, file and path. So I originally had reference to file path. I missed the and. Now I'm also going to add a reference to enum.memcached. And again, I have a typo somewhere. Oops, I'm sorry, it's enum.caching. Okay, so now I've added references and shown you the exception rendering in Ironpython. We have a few namespaces that, for my demo, that I'll want to import. So I'm just going to go ahead and set those up. We're going to use basic types from system, so I'm going to import system. We'll also be looking at, we'll also be making use of some system.text classes. We're going to bring all of those in. We're going to use the Couchbase client from Couchbase. There's a configuration namespace. So I'm going to import the Couchbase client configuration class. And, oops, sorry, should be a dot there. The namespace is Couchbase.configuration. And then finally, from enum.memcached, I'm going to import store mode, and we'll see what store mode is very shortly. All right, so now that we've basically set up the project, again, what we've basically done is if we had just started in the Visual Studio project, we would have had to add references and then using statements to import some, or to work with some of our classes. Again, we've basically done that, the same thing as we would have done in Visual Studio, just at a command line. So now I can create an instance of the Couchbase configuration. So this is newing up a new Couchbase client configuration instance. And you can see the type of config is couchbase.configuration.couchbase client configuration. And what we're going to be looking at right now is the programmatic configuration of the Couchbase client. There are two ways to configure a Couchbase client. One is going to be using the standard app config. One is going to be programmatic, as we're looking at now. And I'll show you the app config way when we move to Visual Studio. It is possible to use that with Ironpython, but it's a little more complicated, so we won't dig into that right now. So there are a couple properties that I want to set up on my configuration object. First one is going to be the URLs. So basically what happens is the client will ask the server for some information about the cluster. The server responds with a series of basically a series of handshakes to tell the client how to go about requesting data from the server and how to go about telling the server where to store data. So you need a starting point URL for that, or a set of URLs that the client can check. So we're just going to use our local host. So we're going to add a new URI. This will just be local. And again, this could be a list of URLs. In the config, the XML config, you would just have a bunch of URLs in a key-value pair section, and we'll see that soon. If I wanted to add multiple ones, I'd just call add multiple times programmatically. And I also need to set the bucket. Buckets are sort of analogous to the idea of a database. If you think of SQL Server you can have one server with many databases. You can have one Couchbase server with many buckets. And it's not, the analogy doesn't hold all the way through, but if you're looking for something just to kind of understand what a bucket is, it's sort of that logical boundary between where you store your data. And you can set a bucket password as well. In the default installation, I didn't set up a password for this instance, so we're just going to set up the default bucket with no password. All right, so now that I have my config object, I can create an instance of a Couchbase client. The constructor that we're going to use for the Couchbase client will accept a config object. So once I create this, the client's actually going to go out and query the server, get a JSON response back, and make another request, and there's just this one-time handoff, or one-time handshake protocol that'll happen that'll set the client up to be able to work with the server for the rest of its lifetime. So this takes just a moment. And when it returns, it's ready for all of the storing and retrieving. So now if I look at what the client is, you can see it's an instance of the Couchbase client. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is just create some data. We're going to work with dictionaries and Ironpython just to keep it simple. We'll look at a more complex type when we move to, when we move into our C# applications. So we're going to create a dictionary named here. And the attributes that we'll set are just simple, name, we'll use 3 philosophers, and the brewer. So now beer is an instance of a dictionary, and now we're going to store that in our database using the store method of our client. So first what I'm going to do, we need a key. Again, I mentioned earlier that Couchbase Server is a distributed key value pair database. Well, that means we're going to need keys for each of our entries. So I'll just create a simple key. So a key that prefaces the key type with some kind of type information and then uses what hopefully is unique. So basically the idea is that you can recreate the key from known entities. So now my client has a store method. The first argument of store is the store mode. And there are 3 store modes to choose from. If I'm entering a value for a key for the very first time, then I use the store mode add. And add will work only if the key does not exist. To show that, so I'm going to do 2 things here. I'm going to create a return value. The store will return true or false depending on whether the store actually succeeded successfully. Depending on whether the store operation was successful. We store mode.add. The key is the second argument. And then the value to store is the third argument. And we'll store our dictionary. So after I run this, if I look at the return value, it was false, which probably means I tested with that particular key before. So let me change the key to something I haven't actually used on this server before. And I apologize, there's something I'm not thinking of here. Store mode should only return false if I've used the key before, and I've done a lot of testing, so it's possible that I've used a lot of these keys before. So let me that I definitely didn't use. So give me 1 second to look back and make sure I didn't add a configuration problem here. Just try one more thing while this is. All right, I apologize for the live demo that inevitably is causing problems. All right, I'm not going to dwell on this in Ironpython because it's very possible that I've inadvertently misconfigured something. I don't see it offhand, but that. If I can't store something I want to make sure it's not something obvious here. I've configured something incorrectly somewhere here because this should be working. All right. Well, I don't want to waste too much time on this. I'm going to move to Visual Studio in a second, but I just want to show you again, this isn't working the way I'd hoped, but you can see the store mode. So there are different store modes. And as I've been fumbling through this, you can see the store mode.add is what we would use if we're just storing something for the first time and the key doesn't exist. Store mode.set. If the key exists, set will override it. If the key doesn't exist, set will add it. So set is kind of analogous to using a save method that you might find in like Hibernate or some of the popular ORMs. There's also store mode.replace. Store mode.replace will fail if the key doesn't exist. Store mode.replace does assume that you do have a key that you're overriding, or a key with a value that you mean to overwrite. So it's like doing an update and having the update in SQL fail if the where value didn't exist. We also saw the get method. The get method takes a key and returns the stored object back to you, or null if it doesn't exist. There are a couple of other methods that I was hoping to show here, but I'm going to skip those for now and just open up Visual Studio. And again, I'm going to assume that I did something wrong in my configuration here. I'm not seeing it, but I don't want to waste time on that. Are there any questions on what I've been kind of poking around with in Ironpython?
There are a couple questions. So let me see. So Patrick was asked back when you were talking about it. He said, so Ironpython .net. So without Ironpython, .net doesn't work with the CouchDB. Is that correct? That's what his question was.
Oh, no. So Ironpython and CouchDB are completely separate. The only reason I was using Ironpython is just to try to show how you can kind of explore the API without having to create a Visual Studio project. You can absolutely 100% use Couchbase without Ironpython.
Okay.
There's no dependency there.
All right, and then when you were having some problems, Marco was saying something in the chat about the port, and I don't know if these are applicable. Anna, is that you?
That is, did you say Marco?
Yes.
Marco, thank you. Yes, that is exactly what was missing.
Okay, good. I wasn't sure if that was appropriate or not.
No, that was very appropriate.
Okay, and then Marco did have a question earlier, and I don't know if you want to take it now, but he was asking just when is an updated C# library taking advantage of views going to be released?
Sure. So I will be addressing that towards the end of the talk. The view, there is support for views in a developer preview that's not actually available yet on the site. I would say in the next few weeks we'll have something that you can start playing with for that, if not sooner. And that'll be something again I talk about in the last segment of the talk.
Okay, that's all for now. So go ahead.
Okay, so actually now that Marco reminded me that I was missing the port, so when I added my URL, I added the URL without the 8091 port, and that's definitely needed. So now let me just recreate my client with that new config. Let's see if our store, go back here. There we go. So again, what was missing there, in case you missed that, here in the config.urls.add, I added the URL without the port. So the port 8091 is the port that the server is listening on. So once I added that, you can see that when I called client.store, it returned true. One of the improvements that we'll be working on for new versions of the .NET client, or that I'll be working on for the .NET client, is to give you more information when you do get failures. There is, you do get the Boolean as to whether it succeeded right now, and there is a way to turn logging on, so you can actually kind of look through the log4net logs to see what really went on. But we're going to try, I'm going to be working to make that much more transparent in the future. So now if I do a client.get using the key, you can see that I got my value back. And so again, if I had done the store, I'm just going to let Ironpython give me the return value directly without having to assign it back. If I had done a store mode.add again with a key that already exists, I get false because I can't use add for an existing key. But if I used a replace, it works fine. Or if I use set, again, set will replace if the key exists, and it will add if it doesn't. So set is analogous to save in most ORMs that you might have used, like in Hibernate, and add and replace are analogous to create and update. We saw get. So a couple of other methods that are useful. Let's say you wanted to have a counter or some value that you need to increment or decrement by some value regularly. You can use the increment method. The increment method takes a key name, takes an initial value, and then a value by which to increment or decrement. So you can see the current value is 1. If I call this again, every time I call increment, if the key already exists, then it just ignores the default value and adds whatever incremented value that I included there. Similarly, I can use the decrement method. There's a remove method if I want to take an object out by key. So if I remove the value at counter A, now if I call decrement again, if the value still existed, it would this return value would be 101. But you can see that it's down to 100 because the remove actually removed that value. And two other API calls I want to mention are append and prepend. So you can imagine a scenario where your key value pair and the actual value for that is something like a comma delimited list of strings or something to that effect, where you're constantly adding values to it or taking away values or putting values ahead of it. So what you might do there is something like this. So we'll start off with creating a string to store. We're just going to store a simple string. Obviously, I've already stored foo. So a new string foo2. Now I'm going to prepend a string to that. So I'm prepending to foo2 an array segment. So an array segment is part of the standard .NET library. It's a chunk of an array typed to a byte. So we're going to pass in a segment of a byte array. And the bytes that we're passing in are going to be the bytes that come back from the getBytes method of our default text or default encoding object. So now if I look at foo2, you can see I have the string before foo. I should have said before bar, sorry. Similarly, I can use the append method. My screen resolution is cutting some things off here. So by the way, this square bracket byte, this is generic typing in Ironpython. So if I append some bytes after bar, if I look at foo2 again, you can see I have before, again, should have been before bar, bar, after bar. So the append and prepend methods let me put data before or after an existing value. All right, so now I'm going to jump over to Visual Studio. Are there any questions? I know we kind of broke in the middle of the Ironpython, but are there any questions before I jump into Visual Studio?
No questions so far.
Okay.
Wait. Wait. I'm sorry. I haven't scrolled down. So there's a question. Is there a TTL property that you can set as well?
Yeah, there are a few different properties in the web config you can set that are around TTL. I don't recall the actual property names offhand, but there are. They do exist in the configuration object.
Okay, and that's the only one. There was another, but people answered it. So go ahead.
Actually, I may have misunderstood that question. I think if the question is more, if it's more of a Memcached, how long do I want something stored for? Yes, that does exist. Each of the store method does have an additional parameter that I can set that will, be of that'll be datetime. I can do datetime.now, add minutes. So instead of persisting indefinitely, I can make something expire if I'm using, the typical Memcached approach where I just want something in cache for 5 minutes and then have it be invalidated. So hopefully that answers that question. There's a server level configuration, but that isn't quite the same as this I was referring to. So in terms of storing for a particular amount of time, storing a value for a particular amount of time, you can use the overloads for the store method to set an expiration date for the data. Okay, so I'm going to jump over to Visual Studio and create a new console application. And we'll just call this Hello Couchbase, which might already exist, so let me. Just a couple of things to point out in Couchbase when creating a Couchbase console application. If you're taking this approach, something important to know about Visual Studio console templates is the target framework by default in Visual Studio 2010 is the .NET Framework 4 client profile. The Couchbase DLL is compiled against the full .NET 3.5 framework, so the client profile is only a subset of the framework, and you won't be able to compile a Couchbase application unless you're targeting the full framework. So I'm going to change the target framework. And again, this would have worked with 3.5 as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is show you how to get the Couchbase NuGet package. So if you haven't installed NuGet, you can get it. You can download it from NuGet.org. And I think you can just add it as an add-in using, I forget how I originally installed it, but under the add-in manager or extensions manager, you can grab it there. But once you add that, you can now add references through NuGet. So if I add my manage NuGet packages, my reference screen and some of my screens might look a little different in Visual Studio. Just to point out, this isn't necessarily NuGet. This is because I've installed the Power Commands and the Power Tools add-ons that are free, and I definitely recommend people look at those. And also this listing here that says Couchbase under the possible places where I have NuGet packages, that is not an official Couchbase NuGet repository. That is my own local when I was testing the NuGet package. So if you are familiar with NuGet, don't be confused by this Couchbase location here. I am going to install Couchbase from the official package source. And once I search for Couchbase, I can see the Couchbase.net client library. And it's that simple. And what NuGet did for me was it automatically added references to Couchbase and enum.caching and created this packages.config file that just tells NuGet which version of the package it has. So the first thing we need to do is add some configuration to our app config. And I'm just going to copy this over so I don't have to type all the XML. But while we're in here, while I'm in Notepad 2, you can see the easiest or the simplest configuration that you'd use is to add the section named Couchbase, and then to create a Couchbase section that has a servers node where you define things like the bucket password, and then the URI list. So if I had multiple servers in my cluster, if I had multiple nodes in my cluster, I could add a list of those here. But again, since I have only one and this is my local machine, I'm just using localhost on port 8091, which is again the port I missed in the Ironpython demo, and then that's it. So this is enough configuration to get our application up and running. So over in Program, I'm now going to first create an instance of the client. So now the default constructor for the Couchbase client no longer has a dependency on the default constructor for the Couchbase client no longer has a dependency on a config object. What this constructor will do is it'll go look for a section named Couchbase, lowercase Couchbase, and then if it finds it, it'll configure the configuration instance on its own. Most likely, this is the type of configuration you'll do because it's more flexible for managing production configuration, etc. So now, once I run this, see we have no errors, so that implies that we had correct configuration. But I can also start testing it. So I'm going to create a simple model object. So we used a dictionary when we were working within Ironpython. Now I'm going to create a class to show you the only requirement for creating a model class that you're going to persist in Couchbase. And that's simply to mark your class as serializable. So I'm just going to create a very simple class. And we'll just have the ID and then we'll just have the ID return the name with spaces replaced by underscores. So very simple. Or we'll make it so just a very simple key creation scheme. So now over here in my program, I can create an instance of a beer. And now I can persist that using the client's store method. And then the key, I'll use the beer's ID property, and then I'll save the beer. So I'll store the results and then print it out. Actually, instead of printing out the results, actually instead of doing that, I'll just do a get and then print out the result of the get. So one of the methods I didn't show you in Ironpython is that we actually have a strongly typed get by using the generic version of it. Because if I wanted to have a line like this, where I actually can type out or actually print out the name of the beer, if I didn't use this overload or this generic version, get just returns an object. So I'd either have to cast the return value or again use that generic version, which is the preferred way to avoid casting. Note that if the value that comes back from the get is not an instance of the thing I said it was, then this will fail with an invalid cast exception. So I want to just jump into my MVC sample. This was just to kind of show you how to use NuGet to get a application up and running. I don't want to look at any of the other methods. We already kind of looked at those in Ironpython. But are there any questions about the Visual Studio setup before we look at a little more involved with the sample?
Yes, there is a question. Marco. Sorry, I heard an echo, my voice on the line. I don't know if other people hear it. But it says, Marco is asking, the client library is compiled against Memcached DLL. Sorry. What functionality does it use from the namespace Memcached?
In this example, the only thing right now that's being used that's coming in from enum.caching.memcached is this store mode. That's an enumeration that's defined in that assembly.
Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Yep. Now I'm going to create a new project. And this is going to be an MVC3 web application. Let's call it Couchbase MVC. just create an empty. Okay, so now I'm going to create that same beer model again. And just to save time, I'm going to copy some of the code so we don't have to watch me type again. So again, there's nothing special about any class that you want to save to Couchbase Server. The only special thing about it is that it has to be marked serializable. And I'm also going to add another class here because, as .NET developers, one of the patterns that we often use is the repository pattern, which, depending on your data access method, you tend to have different approaches for creating your repository. I'm not putting this out there as the ultimate repository for your project, but just to get you started, I'll show you how to create a repository of P for Couchbase. And this is definitely missing some functionality like get all, etc. Let me just add my usings. Oops. I inadvertently. I didn't add I haven't added my references yet. So let me go back and add my NuGet package references. Now, if you don't know the shortcut for quickly adding using statements, it's very useful in Visual Studio. When you see that little blue line pop up, instead of using your mouse, you can just do Control dot, then Enter. So my repository of T, in my repository, I create a static instance of the Couchbase client. The reason I do this, the reason I'm creating a static instance is because it's very expensive, relative to other operations in Couchbase client, to create that initial instance. That whole handshake process is a little involved, so you want to minimize how many times you actually create your client. So we're just going to use the repository static constructor, and create a single static instance of the client. There are other approaches that you can take. This is just one of them. In a more fully baked application, I would probably implement some sort of, the client does implement the iDisposable pattern, so I would probably have something to allow this repository to dispose of the client. Right now I don't have that. And then we just have a couple of quick methods that you might expect to see in a basic repository. We have the create method, which calls the client store method using the add store mode. We have, and also notice that in this very simple example, I'm just returning void, which I should probably update to a bool to take advantage of the fact that store will give us information about whether an operation succeeded. My update method just calls store using the replace store mode, and save will use the store mode of set. Again, to refresh your memory, store mode.set will call store, saying if the key exists, overwrite the value. If the key doesn't exist, add the key in the value. And then I have a get method that just uses the generic get. Again, when I create a repository to extend this repository, I will be explicit about the type. So the first thing I'm going to do is unmark this as abstract, and I'll show you why I did that in just a second. So let me just compile and make sure I have all my references set up. Now I'm going to start using just some of the code gen tools so that we can get through our basic CRUD functionality here. So I'll add a controller with empty read-write actions. My beers controller, when I create this, I'll have my index, details, create, edit, etc. And then I'm going to start with a create method so we can actually add some data. So I'm going to add a view. The view I'm going to add is called create. I'm going to create a strongly typed view that is a beer model. For this example, I'm obviously going to ignore things like view models, things like validation. We're just quick and dirty, show you how to create a repository and do some basic CRUD. And I'm going to use the create scaffolding template. When I add this, what the template did for me is it created a full form for creating instances or creating records of our beer class. And the other thing I forgot to do is actually put this in a beers folder so that the MVC convention will find this view when it needs to. I'm going to create one other view while I'm in here using the scaffolding for details. So after we create the record, we want to redirect to the details view, which will let us see that it was actually created. I'll use the details template. And you can see all this is doing is rendering out the name and the brewery. But the important thing is that I didn't have to actually have to write any of this HTML myself. The scaffolding from MVC's templates took care of that for me. So now back in my repository, I'm sorry, not in my controller, I'm going to go to the create methods. So there are two create methods. One just returns the view, and that's fine. So let's actually run this to see what it actually looks like. I'll get a 404 at first because the default route on any MVC project looks for a controller named home. So I need to, I just lost my port there, so let me run that one more time. So you can see that our create scaffolding gave us a nice little form here for creating new records of our beer type. So back in Visual Studio, I actually need to put some code in to handle creating. So the first thing I'm going to do, because I created a strongly typed view in my create, you can see that we're creating instances of beer. In my beers controller, I don't have to use a form collection. I can actually use bidirectional data binding that comes from MVC by default, and actually just save out the beer. So the first thing I need to do is actually create an instance of my repository in my controller. So I'll just create a private repository. Just double check my had a typo in there. So my repository, I'll just be a little lazy and new it up right here. Once I have that repository created, in my create method, I can create an instance of my beer. Oops, I need a key, obviously. So I'm going to create an instance of the beer in the database using the ID of the beer as the string. Using the ID of the beer as the key, and then the actual beer instance as the thing to save. And then instead of redirecting to index, I'm going to redirect to details. And I'm going to pass in the ID as the ID that we just saved. So if you're not familiar with MVC, what's going to happen here is that this redirect to action will redirect the browser to the details action. So in the URL, it'll be /beer/details. And then it will append the ID as a parameter to the request. So back in details, you can see what details is expecting is an int. So the default, the expectation in MVC scaffolding is that you're working with a traditional relational database where keys are simply integers. But obviously we're not working with integers, we're working with strings in this case. So we're going to change this to string. Then all we have to do here is retrieve our beer out of the database using the repository's get method. And then pass that beer to the template. Because remember, our details view is bound to a beer instance. So our template expects us to pass back a model of type beer, so our beers controller will provide that here. So now if I compile this, go back to Chrome, I can create an instance of a beer. If I create this and I did everything correctly, we should redirect the details page. And I forgot something important. That is, I didn't actually add the configuration section to my config file here. So let me just copy that in quickly. So I need to add the config section reference and then the actual Couchbase section. So if I refresh that, hopefully the yellow screen of death goes away. There we go. So you can see that the details is pulling out of the database our old Yankee Ale instance. And then I'll just add one last thing to this, one last feature, and that's an edit. Edit's going to be very similar to details. I create a view named edit. I use the edit scaffolding. And instead of having just labels with simple divs, right, we actually have text boxes that'll show up in this with the scaffolding. Now over in the controller, if I go to the edit method, again, because we're using string IDs, I need to change the expectation to a string. I'm going to pull the beer out of the database. And return it to the view. So if I now click on edit, you can see that the edit form is set up correctly. And then to save the edit, save the changes back out. Again, I need a string ID. And then an instance of a beer because I'm using the strongly typed views. So I'll just use repository.update. You can actually just use the ID here and then save the beer. And again, instead of redirecting to index, I'm going to redirect to details, passing in the parameter of the ID. So if I change the value to Cottrell Brewing Company, click Save, you can see that the value is updated. So that was kind of quick, and I apologize for that. So that's the basic. That's the basic pattern. I would go about using in an MVC application or any web application if you wanted to create a repository. One thing you could do if you wanted a more generic or a little more control over your repository. You can make your class abstract and then create actual typed repositories. So if I wanted to create a beer repository, my beer repository simply has to extend the repository where it's typed to a beer. So now if I compile this, it'll break until I change my controller. Now instead of creating a repository of type beer, I create a beer repository, and the beer repository is then responsible for generically typing the base class there. And if this works right, I should still be able to retrieve. Are there any questions with this demo before I finish up with 2.0 updates?
A couple of questions. And my clause. You know, I hear myself. Are you running a speakerphone?
Am I? Yes.
I don't want to have everyone echoing, so you just pick it up while I'm talking. So Bob asks, we're currently using NEM-based DLL. Can we easily replace it with this new client?
Yes, the Couchbase client is fully compatible with the NEM client. So most of the functionality that the Couchbase client does have comes from the NEM client. So it should be more or less, I mean, you're still going to need the NEM client there somewhere, but you should be able to set up the configuration to use a different bucket type. So you could actually use the Memcached bucket type and have it work as if you were using the NEM directly without having to worry about the subtle differences between a Couchbase setup and a Memcached setup.
Okay, and he asked a question right before that. Ask this first. What's new in this library compared to NEM-based DLL?
Sure. So just a little bit of history for everyone. The Couchbase client that was released on Monday was really, so the 1.8 release of the server did contain some bug fixes, and it did contain some improvements. But the move to Couchbase Server 1.8 and these new client libraries that were released on Monday were primarily driven around our sort of corporate product change. If you know the history of the company, there was Couch 1 and there was Membase, and then they became Couchbase. And up until release 1.8, there was Membase Server. So we changed the product name formally to Couchbase Server at 1.8, and going forward, there's only Couchbase Server. So 1.8 kind of led to the clients also having 1.0 changes that were about getting the namespace right. So there's no more Membase reference. Attila, who's the owner of the NEM.caching framework, he's no longer going to be maintaining the Memcached the Membase client that you may have used before. So if you were using the Membase client that was part of his GitHub drops, then that'll no longer be supported going forward, and he'll actually be just dropped out of his repository at some point. So it's a little more than a name change, but a lot of what this new client is about consolidating into just the Couchbase product name and the product support for the new server. So it's a clean break from the past, I guess, is the way to think about it best.
Okay, that's good context. And I don't know if this is related to what you just said, but Mohammed is asking, is there any way for auto-generating a key or ID? There are different strategies you can use. Some stuff will make more sense when you get into the context of 2.0 and you're thinking about views. One of the strategies that's common is to use
So to preface it with something meaningful about what type of data it is. So if you're storing, because again, when you're working with a key value pair, you don't have the concept of a table or a collection or something that kind of gives a broader type or taxonomy to your data. So you can preface your keys with something predictable like user underscore username, user underscore email address, or something like that. You can use GUIDs. That makes it a little harder to retrieve things predictably. There are a couple of different strategies for storing metadata about your other records in one record. For example, you might create a record that contains all of the keys that are related to stored beer instances, for example. So if you were using GUIDs or something that you really didn't have an easy way to kind of look them all up, you might do something like that. But in terms of the client providing automatic functionality for key generation, you're expected to pass the client the key you want to use.
Okay. All right. So why don't you wrap it up, John?
Okay.
Thank you.
So the last thing I want to mention is just Couchbase 2.0. So I've alluded to it a couple times. Just get back into my slides here. The Couchbase Server 2.0 is going to be a significant change, not a breaking change in terms of the Memcached stuff that we've been offering, but it will offer, I guess one way to think of it is it's putting some couch in Couchbase in a meaningful way. We're going to be offering, aside from things like an improved web admin, the big changes are the secondary indexes for JSON documents and full support for incremental MapReduce. So what that means is if you're familiar with CouchDB, your skills will transfer nicely. If you start storing your data as JSON documents, we'll do some stuff on the server to take care of optimizing that, how it's stored. But the important thing is that you'll be able to write MapReduce views that will be queryable using the HTTP interface, the REST interface that Couch offers for views. And the new client libraries will all support that. And there's some, and once that happens, you'll be able to really take full advantage of rich documents, rich data stores. You'll still, optimally, you'll still want to use primary, the hash table keys when you can, just because that's always going to be the fastest way to access data. But you can create these secondary indexes that will let you create much more flexible queries than if you're working with just a key value pair. Right now, the 1.0 client doesn't offer any support for this because it's not actually in the server yet. There is a developer preview 3 out currently. You can grab the latest executable for installation from Couchbase.com. And I'll be dropping into GitHub, I'll be dropping a preview of what's coming with the new client library so that people can start playing with that now. If you're going to start using Couchbase now and you're looking for a way to create JSON documents easily, I'll just, in 2 minutes, let me just show you how to do that quickly. And I actually have a tutorial for this at Couchbase.com. The final thing I'm going to do is add my MVC project here. I'm just going to add a class called Couchbase Client Extensions. And then I'm going to mark it static because I'm going to put some extension methods here. And I'm just going to copy and paste some data or some code here. So I have 2 extension methods. Let me just add my usings here. So .NET offers, out of the box, the data contract JSON serializer. So I'm just going to add a quick reference to system.runtime.serialization, which is where that class lives. If you're using 3.5, If you're compiling against 3.5, this class is actually in system.web.something. I forget exactly where offhand, but it's not in runtime serialization in 3.5. And what these extension methods do is they add store JSON and get JSON methods to the Couchbase client, which lets you store your objects as JSON and get your objects back as strongly typed. Get your JSON documents back as a strongly typed instance of key. So once I've added these, I won't go into the details of how it works. It's basic usage of the data contract JSON serializer. But once that's in your project, you can then change your repository to work with JSON documents by instead, where did I put this in the model? So now my client has store JSON. Should have store JSON. Is that what I call it? It should be. Let me give me 1 second. It should be storing. Not sure why that's. Yeah, my create method. Yeah. My store JSON method is just returning Boolean. That should be okay. Sorry, rushing through this at the very end here. It's probably not the best idea. Then get should be right. I need to because there's a dependency on T being a class, not a value type. I do have to mark the generic on the repository to be of class. So now once I run this, let me go back to the create. So if I store so this is actually now storing JSON on the server, not no longer storing just a serialized object. So again, if you're thinking of 2.0 and you want to start using Server 1.8 now, you might want to start storing your documents as JSON. When the 2.0 server is released, I'm going to be working to make the client a little smarter about how it allows you to store JSON. For now, these extension methods are there for you to kind of introduce that feature earlier. I'm hoping to get that in a little sort of transparently once the once the new client is released. Any questions on the 2.0 stuff?
John, there was a question earlier. I don't know if it's specifically on the 2. Oh, yes. But Patrick was asking if you would say something regarding .NET and CouchDB for distributed computing.
Sure. So for CouchDB, one of the things we used to offer, Couchbase used to offer a Couchbase or CouchDB standalone server option. We no longer offer that we no longer support that as of version 1.8. For CouchDB, there are different open source clients out there. The one that I've personally found the most usable was Loveseat. I don't want to speak as an expert on those libraries, but that was the one I've used when I've experimented with CouchDB and .NET directly. The developer who started CouchDB works for Couchbase now, and he's recently posted sort of his thoughts on CouchDB and why he started Couchbase and why he's moving forward with Couchbase. So CouchDB is a great product. It's an Apache-supported product, but again, we don't really have a direct influence over how it works or the clients or anything like that. But if you're interested in .NET and CouchDB, there is Loveseed as an option, and that's on GitHub.
Okay, and then Matt is asking, when is Couchbase 2 due to be released?
I don't know of a formal release date, but it should be this spring.
Okay.
That's my expectation, but I can't say for sure. That's sort of speculative.
Okay, good enough. And then, John, I think that's all the questions, but I hope you'll tell people where they can find more information about the, sorry, I'm getting that echo, and how to contact you if you need to.
Sure. So if you're looking for more information, the first place to start would be the Couchbase documentation. We just refreshed all of the client SDKs, the documentation for all the client SDKs, so couchbase.com/docs. Actually, on Monday morning, we released a brand new couchbase.com site with a whole bunch of new samples and a whole bunch of new, new samples and new docs that you can read through. We do monitor the forums, so we have couchbase.com/forums/SDKs, and those are specific forums for the client libraries, but you can go up a level to just forums and ask topics or ask about any topic related to Couchbase. We do all posts regularly, various blogs on how to do different things with Couchbase, so you can go to blog.couchbase.com for that. There is a Google Groups available at groups.google.com/group/Couchbase. You can always find me on Twitter at Couchbase. And if you have any questions for me, you can definitely feel free to email me. I'm john@couchbase.com. And I'll try to help you out or lead you in the right direction. I would definitely encourage you to start with the forums, for contacts, because we do monitor those and we do try to be responsive there. So that's it for me. If anyone has any questions,